Hey guys, noticed this wasn't working at school, so I'm doing it from home real quick. We're gonna take a look at after World War II, how things work here in the U.S. and abroad. So we're looking at the Cold War, domestic change here at home, and the first thing after the war is a big post-war economic boom. First off, all these guys come back from the army, fighting overseas. A lot of times, women are laid off. The fact is that take a little break. You have to retool, go from making you know bombs and tanks and planes, that kind of, to making cars and consumer goods, stuff we're going to use, refrigerators, stoves, those kind of things, all right? Because all these guys come home after the war, the huge economic demand. With ration, we haven't had these goods for a long, long time. And also that means that inflation takes place. So this is called the Consumer Price Index over here. And it shows what the value of money is and how much prices are. All of a sudden, right here, 1945, prices jump huge. That's because there's so much demand for goods and not enough goods out there. So prices all the way through the roof. That's one problem right after the war. Another thing we have going on is something called the GI Bill. Okay, it's called the GI Bill of Rights. Now, GI is a government issue, what they nickname soldiers. And it was a program for World War II vets. If you fought in the war, you were a U.S. veteran, you got a very low interest loan for college or for homes, those things. Still around today. If you're in the Army, military, and you are in for so many years, you get a very low interest loan for education. With more guys, more people going to college, it led to more white collar jobs, and more people going to business, marketing, sales, all those kind of things. And also more people buying homes because now you get these low interest loans. You go and buy a home pretty cheaply using your GI Bill. So also now we have more people working in white collar jobs, office type jobs. We have more people that are buying homes, and it's going to change the country a lot that way too. We also have a baby boom. These guys all come home from war and make babies. There's an explosion of babies. We're talking one baby being born every 3 seconds from 1945 up through the 1950s. Soldiers coming home was a big part of it. The other part is called the American dream. The idea that you come home, get married, buy a house, raise a family. It's considered what you are supposed to do. And so we see this big, huge baby boom. And so this would basically be my parents' generation, are part of the baby boomer generation who are now just at retirement age now, where there are millions of people that are being born between 1946 and in the end of 1950s. Um, and so it's part of this huge explosion of population in the U.S. as guys going from war, better medical technology, all those things play a role in terms of our baby boom. Now, where are these people going to live? Well, this guy named William Levitt created something called the suburb. The idea of living outside the big city. So Levitt bought up all this land outside of New York City, and he built these houses that are literally all the same, almost like prefabbed houses. All came in big chunks, all on city streets, all the same trees in front of them. Honestly, people actually got lost. They didn't know what house it was because they all looked the exact same. They had to look at the numbers. Biggest thing, if you're building these houses very, very cheaply, is a chance to own your own home, own your own little piece of grass. And so people start leaving the cities for the suburbs. Also, there's something called white flight. A lot of times, people who were making some money decide to leave the cities where minorities had moved into during the wars and head out to the suburbs. So now all of a sudden, the inner cities became more with different minority groups, whether it be African Americans, Hispanics, Puerto Ricans, so on and so forth, in like New York or Chicago, or whatever. And the idea of white flight of the more affluent white people leaving the cities for the suburbs, that led to a lot of property values going down, issues of support for the cities going down, and now people who are working in the city don't live there anymore. You live outside the city, driving to work every day. Because you're driving to work every day, we have a new automobile culture. After World War II, you make other stuff, so we have all new kind of cars. Cars coming out, like cars like sedans, muscle cars. The idea of the Thunderbird starts coming out of here. By the 60s, you have the Corvette, and all those kind of things. And so one of the big things with the cars is that you have to travel from the suburbs to your job in the city. So you live outside in Levittown, kind of that area outside the city, and now now you have to drive into work every so days. People start spending a lot more time in their car. Kind of where you start seeing fast food, all those kind of things develop as well because that automobile culture exists. Now, during the war times, a lot of these groups had signed no strike pledges. And so when the war is done, those no strike pledges are no more. And also now we see a lot of labor unrest happening in the U.S. In fact, in 1946 alone, 4 million workers went on strike for better wages, better conditions, those kind of things. because now it was okay to strike. It was now not an issue of hurting the country, that kind of thing. In fact, 1946, the year the most work hours were lost of any day, and so workers started saying, well, hey, we need better, I get, the war is done, war is over. Now it's time for us to, get a piece of the pie in terms of the work we did, the work we're doing, as we need to make more and more goods. So let's take a look at the president of the early 50s here, Harry S. Truman. Obviously, he takes over in 1945 after FDR passed away. He was the last president to not go to college, actually. So he never went to college. He was a failed businessman. He failed at Taylor, got into politics. Um, and one of the biggest things about him is that he was very anti-communist. He was not a fan of communism at all. He was also not a fan of Stalin at all. In fact, when they meet at Potsdam, they're kind of at each other a little bit. Um, and he was a little bit in your face. He was very animated, very in your face. You get up and explain why he thought he was right, those kind of things. And he had a famous sign on his desk that says "The buck stops here." That he's the man who makes the final decision of what should happen, especially when it came to money and spending and those kind of things. And one of the first things that Truman does that actually is a little bit in terms of controversial is civil rights. And so he created, obviously, there's some civil rights issues, big question of civil rights coming out of the war in terms of, we were fighting against racism and these problems in Nazi Germany. Well, what about them here at home? Truman creates a civil rights commission, a group here looking at civil rights problems, those kind of things, and he actually issues an executive order, that being basically a law, if you will, issued by the president, a rule, a control, a kind of order from the president that said segregation in the army is done. The president, being the commander in chief, can make rules for the army, and so before we had segregated army units, those are now no more. Um, all army units will be integrated. It's very, very controversial at the time. It was front page news. Notice here it says posse bent on lynching, searches for woods for prey. Um, there's still problems happening, lynching, those kind of things happening in the United States. And Harry Truman decides to desegregate the armed forces, which is huge. It's like and some people were all for it. Some people were very, very against it. It was very controversial for Harry Truman. He runs for re-election. So he took over for with taking over for FDR, official FDR's term, and he runs for re-election eventually here. And during this time, politics is a lot more conservative. They're not okay with making too much change anymore. In fact, the different party comes into control of Congress. The Republican Party, Harry Truman is a Democrat, and really the Republicans had two goals. One was to cut spending, okay, and then was to control all those strikes that are happening. So kind of bring the spending under control for the New Deal, and then also try to control the labor problems. And as one of the versions that passed was the Taft-Hartley bill, where business owners would have more control over the unions. So they basically could say, business owners could help control unions and make it so that they couldn't strike, or they had more ways to work with unions um, to try and fix problems that are happening. Actually, Truman took this bill, which would basically take a lot of unions' powers away from him, and vetoed it, but it was overturned. And that made a lot of people really love Harry Truman, because they thought he was all supporting labor and all for unions and those kind of things. Um, in fact, when he runs for election in 1948, he was called a whistle stop tour. He basically rode a train around, and he would give speeches from the back of this train. And he'd go over little towns all over the place as a way to try and drum up support for his campaign. Um, and he was running as Thomas Dewey, Republican, and it was actually a very, very close election. In fact, it was so close that the Chicago paper, when Truman went to bed that night, he wasn't sure if he'd won or lost. And Chicago actually printed Dewey defeats Truman, only to find the next morning that, in fact, Truman had won the election. And a very famous newspaper here that says Dewey defeats Truman, that was printed the night before, that Harry Truman's holding, saying, "Look at me, I won." So obviously, one of the reasons that they're so close, that the Democrats, with Truman being head of that party, were very split over civil rights. There were progressives in the North that wanted to see civil rights, that kind of thing, whereas there were what they call the Dixiecrats in the South, which were all for keeping things the way they were. And so they want to keep things that way. Now Truman starts pitching his plan called the Fair Deal. And the Fair Deal is going to try and fix some of the problems that are happening in the United States. Problems like lack of housing, making sure everybody had a house, everybody had a place to live, nobody was homeless. Civil rights legislation, try and make it so that things for African Americans got better. Things that like lynching, things like segregation, all things we're trying to get fixed, and also trying to find a way to make sure that people have jobs. And so it makes it through Congress and actually does um, bring some of these things into play. But we'll see the Civil Rights Act, civil rights issues are going to become big going forward in the 50s and the 60s. I think look worldwide, Europe is in trouble, right? We're talking 55 dead worldwide from World War II, $2 trillion in money damage is happening. How do you rebuild this? We have those two superpowers now. The U.S., Soviet Union. U.S. had little damage, strong economy. Soviet Union, big military, rebuilding very fast. Just a chunk of their country's damage. They're basically vying for all its control now. Control the United Nations. The United Nations will be part of this as well. With founding the United Nations, U.S., Soviet Union being a big part of that. And if they look at Germany now, okay, as we go from the UN and try and make sure wars don't happen anymore, to Germany. So here's how Germany was divided. Here's the British, the French, the U.S., and the Soviet section. They also took Berlin here, you can see right here, and they tried to divide that into 4 sections as well. When the USSR took over, Soviet took over, they actually put down any kind of rebellions violently, said basically we're going to be in charge right now. So you really can't do what you want to do. Originally, they promised free elections that we're going to have, rebuild free elections, those kind of things. And instead, the Soviet Union put down, so you're going to rebuild our way or else. The U.S. tried to really push for rebuilding, gave money for factories and countries to rebuild and get things going again. And then we really have 2 Germanys. Okay, by 1949, we have 2 Germanys with the West Germany Democratic, East Germany, which is communist, and then Berlin is split the exact same way. It's not easy to cross the border. Okay, you were not just allowed to walk back and forth across Germany. It was, there's gates, and soldiers, those kind of things to not let you go back and forth with fear of spies and all that stuff. There are people whose families were separated, with some in East, some in West Germany. So we have this Cold War going on. Cold War is not fought with armies, instead it's fought with distrust and espionage. The threat that, hey, we're going to go to war with you, we're going to attack you, we're going to nuke you. And really, it's a war of diplomacy. You're trying to get all the other countries in the world to follow you. So we see 46 new countries being founded after World War II, all these former colonies. And the Soviet Union and the U.S. are going to try and sit and figure out who's going to follow who. And so it really comes down to those ideas. At Yalta, Stalin said he would allow the countries that Soviet Union had liberated, taken over, to choose their government. But instead, he creates these little satellite countries. So all these countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania that Soviet Union liberated, took over after the war, became communist. And we think Stalin does this to create a buffer zone, kind of this line of countries here between Soviet Union over here and the democratic countries controlled by the United States, a way so that they can make sure, if the war took place, wars are going to happen here versus happening in the actual Soviet Union, and kind of make that buffer zone between the two to make sure to kind of separate everybody in Europe. Well, Winston Churchill comes to the United States in 1950, and he gives this speech. And he says that there is an iron curtain in Europe. Not an actual iron curtain, but basically this line right here that runs from East Germany, Czechoslovakia, all the way down to Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. This is the line right here between democracy and communism. Okay? No information, no people, no nothing crosses that line from the communist to democratic countries and vice versa. Essentially, you could not cross that border. Information did not cross that border. And there's nothing really going back and forth between the eastern side of Europe, communist, the western side of Europe being democratic. Well, the first test is something called the Berlin Airlift. So Berlin's divided, okay, West Berlin being controlled by the U.S., and there's a highway, the Autobahn, runs through East Germany, from West Germany to East Germany. One of the things Soviets did in 1940 is they decided to cut off supplies that highway. They said the trucks couldn't go in to bring in fuel, oil, and food, those kind of things, to West Berlin. And so the U.S. had a decision, okay? Do you bring your tanks, your bombers, and that kind of stuff in and blow your way through that, open that highway up, which then might cause World War III, or do you find another option? Well, Truman has to decide. He decides to airlift supplies. These planes are literally flying supplies in non-stop, 1 ton at a time, delivering food, fuel, everything to the airport to make sure people were fed and had all that kind of stuff. In a way, it's kind of the first battle of Cold War, if you will. There's no fighting. We had to try to find a way to diplomatically make sure the fighting didn't take place. And this actually kept people fed 4 months in West Berlin. That there was one pilot who would take little handkerchiefs and drop chocolate bars to the kids with airplane to give some kids chocolate, that kind of thing. In Japan, U.S. occupied Japan. Soviet Union didn't. In 1953, where they kind of disarmed them, rebuilt them, a new government in the U.S. features. This is part one, guys. Check part two out in a second.